Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Computer History Museum, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program. I'm Marguerite Gong-Hancock, Vice President of Innovation and Programming. Our public education programs like this are made possible through the generosity of our members and donors. Today, we need your support more than ever to sustain the museum in delivering on our mission to decode technology for everyone, its computing past, digital present, and its future impact on humanity. Here at the museum, as we focus on how tech can contribute to shaping a better future for all of us, AI is an ongoing focus because of its power to fundamentally transform our lives. So we're continuing our series today by welcoming a pair of leading thinkers who bring a lifetime of relevant experience. Together with former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, they spent the past 4 years deliberating, discussing, maybe even debating questions about AI. Today, we'll hear the result of that collaboration. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Daniel Huttenlocher, Eric Schmidt, in conversation with Daniel Lewin. As is tradition, I'll introduce our speakers with 5 numbers. First, Daniel Huttenlocher, inaugural Dean at the MIT Schwarzman College of Computing. 2, founding deanships. 3, product launches. 2007, the year of the Cornell MIT Autonomous Vehicle Fender Bender. 340 citations in 2021 of an image segmentation paper published in 2004, and 6.7 miles of beach, a favorite place to walk uninterrupted. Please join me in welcoming Dan. There must certainly be some interesting stories behind those numbers, Dan. Glad to have you here.
Wonderful to be here.
Next, Eric Schmidt, co-founder of Schmidt Futures and former Google CEO and chairman. 1982, the year earned his PhD from UC Berkeley. 2001, the year joined Google as CEO. 380, the type of Airbus he had the chance to pilot. And 4, the number of years to write The Age of AI. $1 billion committed to find and support global talent. It's always a privilege to have you here at CHM. We're so glad you're part of the community. Welcome back, Eric.
Thank you, Marguerite.
So to lead this conversation today, our moderator will be our own CHM President and CEO, Daniel Lewin. Since 2017, Daniel's been at the helm of CHM with a new mission and vision, building the foundation for reimagining the museum to engage millions of people around the world to leverage technology for positive social impact. He's a veteran of Silicon Valley with leadership roles at Apple, Go, Next, and most recently, Microsoft. He's served on an array of boards from Silicon Valley Community Foundation to StartX. And on a personal note, he and Eric have known each other since their university days at Princeton. Over to you, Daniel.
Wow, thank you, Marguerite, and welcome, Eric, Dan. This is a terrific opportunity today. As Marguerite said, I typically don't moderate these discussions, but it is a special day for me for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the essence of this book that we're going to discuss today is really the essence of the new core mission for CHM. And we are about to enter into a very special conversation looking at the fundamental issues facing humanity. And it's been framed by 3 extraordinary individuals who collaborated over multiple years to write a book for our age. And it is Our Age, the Age of AI and Our Human Future. That's the title of the book. And we're here to engage in this conversation with one major overarching question. And that question is very much at the core of CHM, which is that we are now living in a world of computing that is guided by an inextricably linked and intertwined facet of humans engaging with machines that are programmed by humans and machines that have capabilities beyond any machine we've ever seen before. And so the question that we'll be looking at is what it means to be human in a world of computing. And it has been an organizing principle for the museum, as I said, for the last couple of years. So, while we all appreciate that history is our guide, imperfect as it may be, it is the primary guidepost by which we must look at the future. And so for a moment, let's just pause and look back. About 50 years ago, there was a statement made, often attributed to Marshall McLuhan, but actually made by John Culkin, which is that we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. And also about 50 years ago, the birth of modern computing Very recently, we just celebrated the anniversary of the first microprocessor. We are living in a new age of computing, and we are on the verge of a new age, which we'll discuss today with the authors. Now, if we look back 50 years prior to the microprocessor, just as a guidepost to set up our conversation, there were a number of important historical milestones that have really governed the construction of the world within which we live. The modern electrical grid, structural steel, reinforced concrete, the Model T and all the attendant attributes associated with manufacturing, and the movement of human beings beyond the speed of a horse. Liquid fueled rockets, altimeters, insulin, and even Band-Aids. Think about that. So as we move forward as in the human condition, the question of framing the problem space, which the authors have done extraordinarily well, is really key. And the understanding of how to wield the tools of the day could not be better shaped or discussed than between Eric and Dan, both of whom have had major contributions to the world within which we live. Pointing those tools in the right direction at the right problems with the right insight and oversight is the problem of the age for every age. And lastly, I want to point out a comment that was made by Alan Kay, someone that I know Eric got to work with at Xerox PARC a long time ago, and before that, his time at Bell Labs and writing some of the seminal code that actually governs the way we deal with computers today. And Alan's quote was, "A medium powerful enough to extend man's reach is powerful enough to topple his world." To get the medium's magic to work for one's aims rather than against them is to attain literacy. And that's the goal of this conversation, which is to carry on a conversation, looking at the problems, understanding the questions, and understanding our human future in the age of AI. So let's just begin and start asking questions. And so let me thank you, Eric and Dan, and Dr. Kissinger, who's not here, for writing this book, because I do think it's a milestone book. And so with that in mind, let me ask the first question. What prompted your dedication to this book and the creation of a story and a conversation? How did you all come to work together on this problem? Dan, maybe you can start. And then Eric, if you would chime in, that would be great.
Sure. So in some ways, I would say that the genesis of this book was a New York story. I had a friend in New York who knew Dr. Kissinger. This was when I was the dean of Cornell Tech, the new technology campus that I oversaw the building of in New York City. I had a friend in New York who knew Dr. Kissinger and who said, he's sort of really wants to get his head around AI. Can we get together with him for lunch? And so we started having some conversations, and I brought together some faculty from Cornell Tech. And unbeknownst to me, Eric had also been having discussions with Dr. Kissinger sort of in parallel, and that triangle closed pretty quickly because Eric and I had been working fairly closely around the Cornell Tech project. Google had given us space in their building, and I was meeting with Eric pretty regularly. So that collapsed, and that felt very New York, somehow that kind of collapsing. And as the three of us started to have some initial discussions, we realized how much we had to learn from each other. Which may not have been evident at the beginning when you think about AI, why this set of three people. But we found that as we were taking notes from some of our discussions, that we were learning a lot. And so initially we dug into this for ourselves. And then with the learning, we decided that communicating more broadly in a book made some sense. But there's a piece of history before New York that Eric may want to touch on. So it's a little out of order here, but why should we be temporal?
Good, thanks so much.
So that's all correct. And of course, Dr. Kissinger came to Google in 2008 or so at our invitation. And he began by saying he was concerned that Google was a threat to human civilization, which the Googlers all loved because it made them feel really important. But I learned that his concern was really because he had studied Kant, and that the question of our reality, how is it, what is it, how does it work, how do we perceive it, had been on his mind since his undergraduate thesis in the late 1940s, well before we were all born. So he's been working on this for a very long time. He then had a meeting with Demis Hassabis, who took him through some of the potentials for AGI, and that, I'll just say in my own words, spooked him. that this was real. And he was very concerned that the people who were building the systems were technologists who were simply uneducated in philosophy and history and economics, and that the systems that we collectively, the people literally on this Zoom, would build would make sense to us, but in fact would have enormous social implications. And that's why we wrote the book.
Incredible. So as we think about AI today, are there any things, Eric, in your experience, because you go back to the very beginning of the microprocessor and the work you did at Bell Labs as an undergraduate, and then on obviously to Berkeley, Internet Protocol and Sun and all the rest. Any lessons or considerations relative to the rise of sort of core computing, desktop, if you will, microprocessor-driven computing and AI? Are there any comparison points that you would draw?
Well, I would make an observation that the majority of my career until Google was in infrastructure and engineering platforms. And they didn't seem to have a huge impact except to improve efficiency, make science better, and so forth. When the technology became consumer focused, I don't think any of us understood that we were playing with fire. And I'll give you an example today. People are concerned about social media and misinformation, a very legitimate concern. If you're running a social media company, you try to maximize revenue. The best way to maximize revenue is to maximize engagement. The best way to maximize engagement is to have outrage. So you have outrage. It's a straightforward consequence of a technology group thinking about what their objective function is. And what Dr. Kissinger would say is that those decisions, because they affect human society, need to be made in a context of ethics, in a context of morals, and in a context of history that we don't understand. So let me just fast forward to give you an example of the conundrum. 30 years from now, 40 years from now, whatever, we still have a huge climate change problem, which is going to be with us for the rest of our lives. But we have a new kind of computer called an artificial general intelligence computer that can read all the history and can do scenario planning, and it has human-like judgment. And it looks at our predicament, and it comes back and it says to us, you need to stop fixing climate change because the fixing will produce more deaths in terms of humans because of conflict and war and so forth than the opportunity cost of not fixing it, which is completely counter to how we perceive things. Now, what do you think will happen when that happens? Well, the first thing is people will say, oh, the computer has a bug in it. But let's say people actually look at it and they think, we understand how it came to this reasoning and maybe it's right. Will that change us? Will it change our moral destiny to save our planet in some fundamental way? Will it be treated, in this case, because we don't really understand why it made this recommendation, will it be treated like a god in the sense that we have to follow it even though we don't understand it? These are the scenarios that we explore in the book.
Fascinating. And I do appreciate the look forward. If we look back for a moment at the very beginning of, if you will, a major transformation in society in the Age of Enlightenment and the invention of the printing press, can you draw any conclusions from the pace of change or the governance or political models that might be important?
Dan?
So one of the things that we talk about in the book is the Age of Enlightenment. In the Age of Enlightenment, humans moved from understanding the world through faith to understanding the world through human reason and through faith. And that evolution took quite a long time period, on the order of a century, really. And the movable type press in the West was a very important piece of that because it made human reason much more accessible to a broader and broader range of literate people. But it was measured in decades and even in centuries. And what's happening with AI today, not needing AGI, in Eric's example, I think thinking ahead 30 years is great for sort of visualizing where we might be going. But it's important to recognize that today, with today's quote unquote narrow AI, we're already in a world where AI is shaping much of, I would argue, almost everything that we do, certainly in the social media space. Today's social media just wouldn't exist without AI at the scale that they exist. So now we understand the world, not just through human reason and through faith, but also through this new thing, this intelligence that's not human reason, this intelligence that shapes our daily experience. And that calls for the same sort of level of change in the underlying philosophy and our understanding of history that was called for when we went from just an age of reason to an age of reason and faith. We now have three ways of understanding the world. And just as Eric said, with AGI, that could understand the world in a way that we don't expect. But even today's narrow AI understands the world often, or presents the world to us often. I'm not sure I want to use understand for today's AI or not, but it certainly presents the world to us in ways that are foreign to us. And that really requires a new type of understanding. And we don't have decades and we don't have centuries, given the pace of this technology.
I just got a question from the audience I'd like to intersperse now. We have a variety of skill levels in the audience. And if you would step back, and maybe it's a good one for you, Dan, and Eric, if you want to chime in, that's fine. But just give some base definitions. When you say AI, what do we mean? Just real fundamentals, and then we'll work our way back, because I think that will help some members of the audience.
That is a terrific question, and one that we actually spend time on in the book, because
you do. It's great.
The word AI gets used all kinds of ways, and we really go back to the initial definitions of artificial intelligence in the 1950s and 1960s, Turing, McCarthy, Minsky, others, where the notion was that artificial intelligence is a machine that appears to have human level intelligence on some task or tasks. Doesn't necessarily appear to have human level intelligence on everything. And I think a number of people debate whether that's the right definition or not. And here's the reasoning we use as to why it is the right definition. I think it can help intuitively with the understanding, which is that you can't get in my head and I can't get in your head. We don't have access to what goes on in other people's minds. What we have access to is what they say and what they do. And we understand the intelligence of other human beings through action and through communication. And that's essentially the definition, sort of Turing's imitation game definition. It's if this thing does what appears to be human intelligence, then it's AI. It's not getting inside it and trying to understand how it operates. So we think that that's really, it's the right definition, analogous to how we interpret human understanding. And it's a broad definition, and it's independent of the particular technology or how things operate. And I think that's important because it's something that everybody can understand. And everybody can understand a little bit. Sometimes you have to debate, is this really human level intelligence or not on this task? So it's not always a completely clear boundary, but there are things that are happening today, recommendations being made by social media, results returned by search engines that conventionally would have had human beings doing them. And so it's hard to argue that those are not human level intelligence. Mm-hmm. It's a great question.
So I'm here at a conference today, a tech conference, where one of the conversations is people think that it's a year or two before these conversational systems will look so good compared to humans that you won't be able to tell human versus. Now, we'll see. But at the moment, the so-called large language models, and we profile one in the book called GPT-3, are getting close enough that it's eerie. Now, this has a lot of implications for business. You can do question answering and helping. It also has a lot of implications for learning, because all of a sudden the computer can start to answer questions. One principle is that every AI system that is analytical is also generative. So if it can analyze something, it can also generate something new. So this is the beginning of a kind of intelligence that's human inspired, but not driven by humans. And Dan always tries to remind me that these systems are completely a function of the objective function in the technology today. So one way to say this is, what will the objective functions that people build against look like? And as long as in the next 5 or 10 years, those objective functions are to maximize revenue or engagement or outrage or misinformation, we'll get one outcome. If those objective functions are organized around scientific discovery, we'll get a different outcome. We'll probably end up with both.
Right. That's a good way to think about it. It's basically, how do you feed these systems, right? The GPT-3 stuff puts you in a place where, again, you feed the machines with context and they learn, which is unusual. Maybe either of you or both can comment a little bit then about sort of the essence of machine learning and the forms. You do profile in the book 3 forms of machine learning, and I think that'll, again, help people understand the framing and the relevance of this, the fundamental questions and problems that you posed in the book. So Dan or Eric,
want me to jump in, or do you want to jump in? I'm happy.
Yeah, Dan, you go.
So I think, there are several forms of machine learning that we talk about: supervised and unsupervised learning, and then a number of more specific techniques. But I'm going to go one level higher for a moment, because I think when we think about the framing of the sort of human implications, ethical questions around machine learning, you can often abstract above the level of the specific technology. So I'm again going to use an analogy to human behavior, because I think for the broadest audience, that can be very helpful. When we have humans making decisions about things that really matter to other people's lives, so humans making decisions about whether to extend credit at a bank to somebody, whether to give a mortgage or not, those kinds of human decisions are things that we audit. That kind of human behavior, we pay attention, we sort of trust but verify, and I think that that's a very important thing to think about. There's no reason that machines, no matter how well trained, no matter what kind of how much care was put into what data set was used to train the AI, it's going to be very important that we audit these things when they're making decisions that are important to humans. And many of the places where AI is being deployed today have those kinds of characteristics. When you think about a facial recognition system, how is that actually being used? If it's being used in some law enforcement context, that can have huge implications. Even if the design of the system is that there's a human in the loop, the AI isn't making the decision. It's still making recommendations. People are very susceptible to the recommendations that they got. So it's incredibly important that we monitor and that we audit AI, much like we do human decision-making in places that matter. And then, I think this is a way maybe that the framing of the book is a little different than some of the discussion today. I think a lot of the discussion today, people will say, well, it's very important that we develop guidelines for how data sets ought to be put together to make sure that there's not inadvertent bias in the data. Those are all extremely important. We absolutely agree with that. I still don't think it's enough. Mm-hmm. Because no matter how careful you are in this, you're entrusting a machine to make very high importance, high value decisions or recommendations that affect people's lives. And that has to be monitored and has to be audited.
So to build on Dan's point, this technology is imprecise today. Sometimes the system cannot explain why it made a decision. It's sort of like a teenager. They cannot explain why they did something. The technology is dynamic in the sense that it's changing. It's emergent in the sense that if you combine it with other such technologies, you get behavior that's unexpected in sometimes scary ways. But the most important thing about it is it's busy learning while you're using it. And so the scenarios that we paint in the picture in the book have all to do with what happens when you think the system is stable and then it learns something that you don't like or is unexpected. And we don't even have a language to discuss this. We don't have a way of saying we want to prohibit that or how to limit it. So in Dan's case, you'd have to inspect it. So let's say your inspection regime is once a day. Well, these systems learn so fast that during a one day, it could learn a lot of the wrong things. And then the inspector comes along and says, holy crap, how did that happen? Mm-hmm. Right? We don't have a language to discuss this.
Yeah. So maybe if I could jump in one more second before you, which is just I'm really glad Eric raised the sort of imprecise, dynamic, emergent nature of AI and machine learning. And something I'd like to postulate, which I'm not sure, there are things we all agree on in the book and some things where we're still discussing and debating. This may be only a Dan Huttenlocher thing, but I think one of the things that's really interesting that I think is not debatable, and then I'll make the postulate, machine learning really advanced the breadth of applicability of artificial intelligence compared to approaches that were there before. And so an interesting hypothesis, and one that at the moment I think sort of remains to be disproven rather than the other way around, is that this imprecision of machine learning is actually critical because human learning and human reasoning and human inference are also imprecise. And if you have an overly precise machine, what does it mean for it to sort of behave like a human? It won't. It's always going to get tripped up by being more precise than a human would have been. So I think that this is a very important aspect, possibly of AI systems in general going forward, and a very interesting set of questions from, again, back from this philosophical point of view. Is imprecision in these systems actually core to really human level intelligent behavior?
And by the way, Dan, so the consequence of your point is when the computer makes a mistake like a human does, do you have to put it in prison? In other words, how do you deal with the errors, right? Who goes to prison when the computer makes a mistake?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I was just going to ask the question about any examples of these AIs detecting aspects of reality or creating solutions that, are problems that we've not looked at or solved. So that does get into the realm of politics, if you will.
But one of the points that we make in the book is that AlphaGo and the chess version of AlphaGo, which basically beat the humans at chess and Go, were impressive technologically, really great achievements. But the thing that is extraordinary is that they came up with new ways to play the game. Mm-hmm. Now, these are games that have been played by humans in one form or another for 2,000 years. So this begs the question, is it possible that at some future point, the computer will see a reality that's actually true that humans will not be able to comprehend? So is it possible, and this is speculation now, so we're clear, that this stuff will get far enough advanced that it will see something that we suspect is true, but we cannot, under our own auspices of human intelligence, understand it? It's not because it's smarter, it's because it's a smarter in a different way. And we don't know.
And I think this is a super important point because we've always had computers for the last 20 years or so being able to do more brute force things than humans. They can just process more information. But this discovery of new ways of looking at things or new ways of doing things really is a product of some of the recent advances in machine learning. So if you look at, sort of the IBM Deep Blue sort of chess from 25 years ago, and then the AlphaZero chess today, the big difference is discovery. And as a scientist, I'm incredibly excited about the discovery opportunities in the scientific domain, where people are using machine learning now to solve scientific problems and discover things that people alone have been unable to do thus far.
And Daniel, when I go to the Computer History Museum, and I cannot wait for you guys to reopen, I'm always struck, because I lived through it, how slow all these computers were. Yeah. They are so much slower than I remember, and I remember them as being slow. And one of the questions is, will the underlying technology base that Silicon Valley and semiconductors and so forth represent be able to power this kind of intelligence? And since you're focused on history, one of the historic events is going to be the development of these specialized processors, which enable both inference and computation. And of course, the industry is gaga over these things. It looks to me like the infrastructure, again, represented by the people who are watching this Zoom in our industry, is up to the task. In other words, that the Moore's law will hold long enough that the new architectures and so forth will allow for the kind of computation. At Google, when we started this, we discovered that the best way to do this was to do it with very low precision floating point and then fixed point calculations, which is precisely not what you would expect, right? So there are more of those kinds of discoveries ahead of us. But I'd say that the path for intelligence on computers is almost certain that there will be some. The questions will be, where will its failure modes be, and how will you govern it, right? Can you regulate it? Can you inspect it, and so forth, or do you need to ban it? And obviously, we collectively want this technology to reach its full potential. In the book, we profile Halocin, which is a drug, a new antibiotic, which is extraordinary, discovered by computers and people together. We also profile GPT-3, which is a large language model. Let me just read the back cover of our book. The question is GPT-3 actually capable of independent thought? And GPT-3 is asked this question: are you, the computer, capable of independent thought? And it says, no, I am not. You may wonder why I give this conflicting answer. The reason is simple. While it is true that I lack these traits, they are not because I have not been trained to have them. Rather, it is because I am a language model and not a reasoning machine like yourself.
Yeah.
Now, is that intelligence? Does it have a notion? Does it have a notion of who it is? It claims to. Yeah. It says, I am this and I am not that, and you are this and you are not that.
Right.
How do we sort that out?
It's a rational thought. It's reason. But we're breaking through on that. So let me ask a sort of a high level question about, as we discuss AI's role in society, how quickly do you think we're going to have to organize our political systems to stay ahead of the machine's capabilities? Because you just made reference to a year from now, people believe systems will be conversational, if you will, in the essence of the Turing test.
Well, can I give you an example from China?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So I think China has, whether you like China or not, China has its act together with respect to these issues. They have a national strategy. They're putting an enormous amount of money into this. They're very, very good. They also don't allow anonymous speech and anonymous browsing on the web. Therefore, they're not going to allow it in AI systems. So as these systems get deployed, they'll make sure by regulation, they've just announced an algorithmic regulation, they're going to try a non-democratic way to regulate these systems. What I'm concerned about is they may get there first. They may actually figure out what the excesses and the damage to this in an autocratic system far ahead of the democracies who are busy still spinning from the impact of connecting everyone together. I'm very, very proud that I and Dan and others, even you, Daniel, collectively, we connected the entire world or the majority of the world together. And now we're shocked at what they actually do.
Yeah, no, it's
okay. Like, sorry, we set out to connect them.
Yeah.
So now we have to deal with the consequences of having built all the roads, right? The roads allow the criminals to drive along, blah, 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 all the so forth. We have to think that through. I don't see, and I've not seen an awareness in the political context for how to address these issues. The politicians that I've dealt with deal with point problems. So very specific problem over here, very specific problem here. Dan likes to say that the solution to this is actually getting ethics right. Like, what are the ethics you want to have in this system? And that's a job greater than us. We need our partners from other fields and disciplines to do it. Dan?
Yeah, and I would say on that point, back to Daniel's question at the beginning of going back and looking at the Enlightenment, modern democracies arose arguably out of the Enlightenment and human reason and the sort of challenge to faith as the sole way of understanding the world. But a huge amount of underlying philosophical development happened before the democracies were born. So this new technology had a philosophical basis. It had a way of talking about the ethics of this new technology. We now are in a world where we have these highly developed participatory systems in many parts of the world, and a new technology that is going to have the same kind of powerful effects, we believe, on the structures of those. But we don't have the benefit of the time to develop that philosophical understanding prior to those things happening. They're affecting the systems that we have today. And I think that, the challenge then is we all want to make sure that, I think there's a common goal that almost everybody has around these technologies, which is how do we take advantage of the amazing positive impacts that they can have and ameliorate and limit and eliminate the negative ones. But the question is, if you sort of run out without really understanding the philosophical basis, much less the technological one, and you start to legislate and otherwise these technologies, if that doesn't have sort of the legitimacy that comes from a broader philosophical framing, it's problematic, right? I mean, the prohibition in the United States of alcohol, that was a legislation that in the end people decided didn't have the moral authority of the nation behind it. And so I think that there are really fundamental challenges here about the pace that we need to work at, the legitimacy from a societal and moral point of view of different kinds of regulatory decisions and technological ones. So these are big issues here.
They really are. And you two have, and with Henry obviously, have framed an incredibly important high-level discussion. It took me back when I was reading the book to an inscription that was on the wall of the politics department when I was an undergraduate, and it goes back to Thomas Aquinas. And it speaks to practical philosophy and the three components in modern science: ethics, economics, and politics. Ethics being, the individual good, economics being the collective sharing, and then, politics being the citizen, the community within which you operate. And out of sequence, and with the power of these systems and the pace that the systems are moving, as Eric just described, will we keep up with this? You speak in the book about the divergence, mutually unintelligible realities. So can you comment a little bit about that? Because I found it fascinating, and hopefully it'll draw people into their thinking about what they can do individually, because there is individual action that's important.
This is a great one for Eric, if he's willing to dive in first.
Well, I'm not sure this is a direct answer to your question, but I wonder, since we're all excited about the metaverse, which hasn't been built yet, but will happen, what will be the rules of the metaverse? Human society does need rules. There are bad behaviors. And ignoring who builds it and how it happens, we talk in the book about the digital world becoming so seductive that people using AR or the equivalent will end up crossing over. This is similar to the movie Ready Player One, where you basically end up in a situation where your digital world is so much more satisfying than your physical world. And especially for people who are lonely or people who are in trouble or whatever, can you imagine that they would prefer to escape this? But what happens when we're all in our own virtual worlds? Are those worlds, for example, pleasant, calm, or do we bring the same behaviors and the same stressors and just at higher intensity into the virtual world, which is what happens with gaming? And so again, we're playing with fire in that because these products are generally available, people will have the choice to deploy them or not. And I don't think we don't know what the limits were. Korea just passed a law limiting the number of gaming hours. So did China, because of concerns like this. How will we sort that out? I don't know.
Yeah, fascinating.
And maybe just as a follow-up to that, I think kind of individual divergent realities that Eric just talked about. There's another example of that we have in the book, which is just children growing up with AI teachers and the degree to which they may come to learn this interaction with this AI more than from interactions with peers or from interactions with adults? And does that cause them to create individualized, an individualized learning environment is good in some ways. It's tailored to the way you learn, but it can also leave you in something that's a very independent view of the world that doesn't connect to others.
So let's go through this scenario just to make the point. Every state of the United States has an approved set of high school and undergraduate or elementary school textbooks, right? And there's a big fight over what they should say and so forth. And they are approved, and everyone's required to use those textbooks, roughly speaking. So does the digital best friend of the child, does it have to follow that textbook? And if it does, what are the ground rules? And what happens when it learns something? Like the toy is watching TV with the kid, and they both learn something that's not in the textbook. What do we do about that? And then the toy and the kid self-reinforce each other's learning. I mean, I can give you example after example with young minds that it goes back to this business about the tools shaping, we shape the tools and then the tools shape us. There is no more formative problem than substituting parental teaching by a computer.
That's a fascinating way you describe it. We have reached the stage where, as you said, in the last 10 years, so call it slowly, if you will, but effectively passively, we've been relying on these conveniences based upon economic models that you described. What would you say about sort of the government oversight, really the political oversight that's required in the US, given the situation that we face today and the decision-making that's ongoing in Washington? It's more of a current events question than anything, because there's so much, if you will, that's out of the bag. How do we control the go forward model?
So the only way progress is going to happen in Washington is if there is a shared agreement in the two-party system. In other words, you're going to have bipartisan agreements. And at the moment, the political system doesn't really agree on the ethics and values and rules about these things. And so I think until we can come to some agreement, cultural, on when is it appropriate to stoke something and when is it appropriate to not, it's important. I'll give you the thought experiment. So first place, the technology that Dan helped invent, all of this stuff about imaging, is going to be available in open source libraries to anyone in the world. This is the containment proliferation problem. And everyone will be able to be a misinformer. So you have to assume that every citizen can construct their own reality that they want someone else to believe. They can take a politician and get them to do something that they didn't do, and so forth. We may or may not be able to detect these things, but the incentive to create misinformation is now very clear. And so how do you regulate that? You have to decide what is appropriate misinformation and what is not. Now, if you go back to the printing press, they had all sorts of problems with what are now known as broadsheets, and they ultimately regulated them. Advertising has largely been regulated, and advertising even online is regulated, but free speech is not. Mm-hmm. So we're going to face this question of what is appropriate to put into the common narrative, and the pressure on the social platforms is going to be high because of this. In the book, we have a mention of essentially proof of origin, and there are technical solutions that can show where something came from. And that would at least inform us where it started, and then begin to understand the impact that whatever this thing is had on society. So now you got all that, and I decide to build a system that will convince every single person to follow me as their religious leader or something. I'm obviously a charlatan. And so what I do is I learn what their hot points are, and then I use a computer to target them to precisely their weakness or their belief on an individual basis to get them to come to my side. It's misinformation at scale directed at each individual. AI is very, very good at that sort of thing.
And one thing Eric said sort of in passing there that I'd like to expand on for a second is, increasingly AI through machine learning algorithms is what's deciding what we should see. It's what's being pushed at us through news feeds, et cetera. It's what we see when we search. And I think there are a lot of differences between information being made widely available and information through means that are not being directly overseen by people being pushed at people. So the notion of who's recommending, who's responsible for making that recommendation, how is that recommendation being made, are very important things for us to start to think about. And that the dialogue today is not that nuanced around those questions. Let's just put it that way.
Right. So we have our own political systems to deal with, and the conflict and the stalemate that's existing in national politics in the US. If we bump it up a level and we start to think about international relations and the governance frameworks that are conceivably emerging, Eric, you spent a considerable amount of time and intellectual energy against this National Security Commission on AI. And it's a delightfully dense but nicely summarized report. I mean, it's an incredibly deep effort. Would you talk a little bit about the sort of the geopolitics of this issue? Clearly, China is something that you've mentioned already, but there are other actors in the world as well. So maybe between the two of you, you can bounce around a little bit on those two issues.
So in the same sense that in the book, we talk about the impact of all of this stuff on humans, it also has a big impact on governance and on national security. I was fortunate to be the chairman of the National Security Commission on AI for the last 3 years for the Congress, and we issued a public report, which I encourage people to read. It's only 756 pages, but it includes a very detailed analysis of where China is, where the US is on technology leadership, and what we need to do about it. And the summary is we need to do a lot more funding, a lot more immigration, a lot more education, a lot more training, get more talented people into the government, work with our partners, and make sure that our values win. So I think one of the things to understand is that there will be multiple attempts at building these platforms. And it's important, and we say this in the book, it's important that the platforms that ultimately become part of the global framework are ones that reflect our values. And the example I would offer is, let's say that this conversation was interfered with by a foreign power in such a way that my words were altered. That would be unacceptable to me and to everyone in the audience, and them back to me. So we've got to establish some basic principles here about how speech is going to be conducted, how human intercourse, if you will, broadly defined, will be shaped by these tools. One of the things I learned at Google was that video is much more impactful than text. So to the degree that these systems are capable of producing very powerful video amplifiers, recommendation, outrage, and so forth, it's going to drive people insane. And we better figure out how to govern that. The other point that we make in the book has to do with the question of proliferation. And there's a bunch of scenarios like this, but it goes something like this. Our opposition, let's say China or Russia or what have you, has invented some new piece of software. Now, in the past, we would know that they had a nuclear bomb, and we would call them up and say, we know you have this bomb and we want to negotiate how to contain it. We don't want you launching it at us. And the theory of mutual assured destruction emerged from that. In the case where, let's say, Russia has a piece of software that's enormously dangerous to us, the one thing they will never do is tell us that they have it, because the moment they tell us that they have it, we would know to build it too. And so the system, the natural instinct for things which are powerful or dangerous is proliferation. And the end of that is very bad. So we're going to have a doctrine around containment. We're going to have countries agree to this. Another example, we build one of these AGI systems, and it's well ahead of human intelligence in some questions. And somebody asks it, I want to kill 1 million people of a different race than my own. Well, clearly that's not okay. And clearly that those systems should be controlled by governments. Well, what if the government asks the system to give the answer to that question? Again, we don't have an agreement in diplomacy, nor a moral agreement, nor a philosophical agreement on where those lines are.
I think this is a place also where history, Eric talked about development of nuclear weapons, mutual assured destruction. So far, that piece of history has been protecting us. I mean, it's never a given, but it's worked for a half a century. The less sanguine piece of history with respect to technological development that we talk about in the book and we think is very relevant to today and to the international relations between nations is the pre-World War I period, which shares a lot of parallels with today. So that's the period of rapid industrialization, of rapid changes in transportation, development of the railroads. There was a whole bunch of new technologies being developed in the private realm, in the commercial realm, but that had very significant implications for diplomacy, the speed at which things were happening, but also for the doctrines at that point in time of how wars were undertaken. Diplomacy used to be slow, and it assumed it took a long time for communications to happen one place to another, and people didn't respond quickly. That wasn't so true anymore in the period right before World War I. And then with respect to military doctrine, the military doctrines of the time were that you needed to always be moving as much materiel and as many troops as possible to a potential front, because they were developed at a time when it was hard to get a lot of materiel and hard to move it around. But with trains and mass production, that wasn't true anymore. And that became a tinderbox that led to World War I by any historical account. The fact that those technological changes made both the political international relations set of doctrines and assumptions and the military doctrines and assumptions invalid. And with all of the development, not only of cyber warfare, but now of AI, both in the cyber and in the physical warfare domain, and with another huge speed up of communications because AI can think much faster than humans can, there are a lot of parallels to that era. And it's one of the examples that we think illustrates why there's such important things for us to be thinking about.
And Daniel, it's important now, and we say this in the book, that we get started on these conversations now.
Yep.
And the single most important conversation is the launch on warning question. In other words, we don't want the system with its imperfection to make the decision for any military activity. And you sit there and you go, well, why are you so worried about this? I'm worried because of the compression of time. What we now know is that human conflict is going to happen very fast, much faster because of all of these tools. And there'll be a temptation to have the defensive system automatically defend. And yet that in and of itself is escalatory. And so unless we can come up with a sort of a perfect surveillance system that will guarantee that we're not going to get attacked either by cyber or by physical weapons, and we can shoot them down, which is not technically possible today, we're at huge danger of an automatic system deciding that you're in danger, and then the human saying, okay, I agree with you, boom, and then starting a war. We've got to think that through. That conversation is not occurring, as far as I know, anywhere in the world.
That's disconcerting. Which actors should be at the table, given your vantage point on working on this National Commission? Was there an encouragement? Are there any societies that are trying to put forth a frame of reference by which we could begin this conversation?
Well, the normal way you would do this is you would, there's a term now in foreign policy called the T12, which are the 12 most important techno-democracies, as they're called. And so I would start by trying to get an agreement on these kinds of questions among them, because that agreement would reflect the broad consensus about privacy and about dignity of human beings and so forth. And I would then try to get everybody else to agree to that. That is a many-year process. Yeah. One way to understand mutual assured destruction and the nuclear sort of containment regimes that we that were invented in the 1950s, in which Dr. Kissinger participated a great deal, and in this various strategic limitations agreements, which he did in the 1970s, is they occurred after the use of 2 nuclear weapons.
Right.
It would be much better if we could have these conversations before these AI systems are used in the same way, because the destructive potential is enormous.
Yeah, there's a model that I'm generally familiar with, and we haven't talked about this, but clearly there's an escalation process from basic mischief, which we've seen in the computer industry as long as there've been networks, that moves into crime, and then at a government level, espionage, warfare, and then terrorism, right? There's a level of a hierarchy, and there are various actors who participate, from amateurs and professionals who are holding people up. We see this regularly today, where there is a certain ransom being considered, but then there's the government actions. And given the availability of these tools and individual capability to train them, how quickly do you think we can bring together the highest level, the government conversation? Do you have any sense that this can occur within the next 3 to 5 years?
It's hard to know. The government is not focused on these areas. The only way we were able to build a bipartisan consensus over these AI issues was because of the threat of China. The Republicans were worried about it because they're worried about the military aspects.
Mm-hmm.
The Democrats were worried about China because of the humanitarian aspects, and we were able to build a coalition to spend more money. So in our political system, you've got to figure out a threat that everyone can agree on.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's move a little bit away from sort of the geopolitics and talk a little bit about the industrial and the positive sides of things relative to new industries and new invention that you're seeing. Because I know a lot of what your personal interests consider, Eric, are the greater good uses to affect the human condition. So, and obviously, Dan, the work you're doing now at MIT, in terms of the cross-discipline nature of these new machines and the data sets. So can you give us some examples of things that you think have immense potential in the years to come?
Let me mention AlphaFold, and then Dan, maybe you can give some examples from MIT and talk about Halcyon because of the impact it has. This past year saw one of the sort of greatest achievements in science that I've seen in my lifetime. And that is the ability to now map the structure of proteins. And the vast majority of proteins were mapped by something called AlphaFold. And in a competition between AlphaFold, which is a part of DeepMind, which is a part of Google, there was a competitor in the form of the University of Seattle, the David Baker Lab, which did a similar path. The two together have produced a map of how proteins work, which will become the basis for much of how biology, and in particular synthetic biology, works. This discovery, which is thought to be incomprehensibly hard, is likely to win the equivalent of a Nobel Prize. That's how powerful it is. So if you want to know why we're going to live longer, why we're going to have better materials, why the biological world is going to become much, much more important, one of the aspects of this will be the discovery of these proteins. And this was done using essentially an algorithm similar but not identical to how AlphaGo worked. What they did is they looked at all of the state space of choices, literally the way they could fold, and then they optimized to maximize the low energy state, and they figured out a way to do it. And they did it at scale. Humans could never do that. Humans were doing something like 10 a month, and they did many, many, many thousands. Dan?
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more about AlphaFold. It's an amazing discovery, and so many biologists that I know are racing around using it right now. It's going to lead to lots of discoveries. So I will talk a little bit about the Halcyon example because I think it's quite interesting in a number of regards in terms of what AI-aided discovery, machine learning-aided discovery holds for us. So we face a societal problem globally of antibiotic resistance, of the development of bacteria that existing antibiotics are not very effective against, or even just completely ineffective against. And one of the challenges in developing new antibiotics is that the natural new antibiotics are ones that are similar to existing antibiotics, because we understand those chemical structures, we understand how they affect pathogens, we understand how they affect the host. So the whole sort of host pathogen, antibiotic system of interactions is understood, and so you can sort of develop nearby compounds. The problem is that those nearby compounds are also ones that the drug-resistant bacteria know. It's the ones the humans know, the drug-resistant bacteria sort of already know also, because they've learned how to evade the existing antibiotics that we have. So what you really want to do with drug-resistant bacteria is discover some antibiotic that's far away from existing antibiotics in terms of how it operates, its chemical compound structure, and so forth. But that's the hardest part of discovery, because we don't have good models of what's going on there. And this is where machine learning was incredibly important. So this was a structural biologist working together with a machine learning person, and then people in their combined labs. And it really took that. It took sort of knowledge of synthetic biology and drug development and knowledge of machine learning. But they trained an algorithm on a bunch of compounds that had antibiotic effects, some of which were not so good for the host, and some of which were. And then they used that to screen a massive database to try to say, here are some compounds, which ones might, according to what this algorithm was able to learn from the known antibiotic compounds, might be worth looking at. And it's that screening and hypothesization stage that's really hard for people to do, other than almost by trial and error with conventional means. And so they were able to identify a compound that then, first in vitro studies and then some early animal studies was very effective at killing killing off bacteria that were resistant to other antibiotics, but that also wasn't harming the host. And it's that kind of ability to discover something really different that I think is really opened up by machine learning. And it harks back to the example of AlphaGo and AlphaZero, where it discovered new strategies. And that was in a game playing domain. It's a very constrained domain. People, when this first happened, said, well, fine, but it's games and there's a lot of constraints there. But now we have similar kinds of findings in drug discovery, at least in the antibiotic domain. And of course, different kinds of drugs have very different issues around search for new compounds. But I think in general, we're going to see really exciting abilities for machine learning together with experts. This is not just throwing a machine learning algorithm, a bunch of data. It's got to be somebody who understands the characteristics of these compounds and the treatments that are involved. So that, I think, is not just Taliesin, but the whole area of drug discovery is one that's really exciting. Another medical one is more on the diagnosis side, which is that in radiology, in early breast cancer detection, the best early breast cancer detection methods now are machine learning methods. And those are starting to be rolled out on an early basis in a number of hospital systems. So, the antibiotic development is still, takes a huge amount of trials and everything else to be an antibiotic that anybody could actually use in the healthcare system. But some of these radiological techniques are actually already being used. Much faster development cycle.
Just briefly, a couple of other random examples. DeepMind got a 30% improvement in energy efficiency in its work in the data centers. There's every reason to believe that these algorithms can improve loss in energy systems, in particular transmission loss, pipeline loss, and so forth. Even a small percentage improvement drives huge cost improvements and obviously benefits the planets. That's another example. There's plenty of evidence that education can be improved by more targeted and learning systems that learn how you learn. and people are beginning to work on that. I can give you, in every human endeavor, a learning system that starts with a reasonable objective function can really make a run at making things more efficient, safer, smarter, more targeted. Even in the military, one of the arguments in favor of use of AI in the military is that when you look at war, the majority of the combatants who die, the people who die or are injured, are in fact non-combatants. And so using AI to make precision greater is in fact an improvement in terms of the outcome if you measure it in terms of lives lost.
Mm-hmm.
So on the education front, I think, particularly in primary and secondary education, opportunities are huge. There's actually a project between the Media Lab and the Schwarzman College of Computing at MIT called RAISE, which is looking at opportunities there. And in particular, opportunities for underserved communities that globally that don't have access to reasonable teachers, that have a hard time, getting access to good teaching. And so that's something where when we look at AI and machine learning, there may be places in the wealthiest parts of the world where these things can make a difference. We talk about development of expensive, new drugs that may not be cheap in the rest of the world right away. But on the education front, it's something that actually I think can deliver results in very underserved parts of the world.
That makes tremendous sense. Go ahead, keep going, Eric.
I'll come back.
Okay. I'm curious if, given the sign of the times, if there's anything from the COVID crisis, the pandemic we're living in, that is motivated, anything that you've seen in the use of these systems, just for current events comment, if you will, because we're talking about health and drug discovery and things like that.
The drug discovery aspects that Dan described are actually just the tip of the iceberg of what has happened because of COVID. One good thing of this horrendous pandemic has been an acceleration of the rate of discovery in biology. There's a site called SynBio, and there's a group called BioArchive, and collectively they are the other place besides the AI researchers where there's discoveries every day. And so I think we collectively changed the pace of biology research, chemistry research, and so forth in a good direction because of the extraordinary emergency that we've been through.
Yeah. I mean, material science is another area that there have been huge advances, and COVID did drive some of the acceleration in those places too. And AI is being used in those materials discovery. One of the examples I happen to be familiar with, just because I'm on Corning Incorporated's board, is the development of the new glass vials that are so crucial for the delivery of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. And so these are places where new materials discovery is accelerated, and then the exigencies of the COVID era have pushed that speed up, and then those speed ups are with us for future discoveries going forward.
Yeah, fascinating. I think I'll turn to some good audience questions coming in. Hopefully we can take some time for those. So let me start with one from the audience. Is a good test for an AGI that it can tell us how to limit the adverse impact of its own existence?
That is a great question. And that's a good example of why we need people other than computer scientists debating these questions. These are philosophical questions.
Yeah.
So one way to answer that question is to say, do you fundamentally believe that in our lifetimes, or even slightly after, computers will be able to write their own code? Today, there is a product called Codex, which is a coding assistant. And it knows enough, having read all the stuff in GitHub, to know how to finish what you're starting. And it's getting a lot of training data because it sees what it does well and what it does poorly. So you could imagine that eventually humans and computers together will train the computer what the closed form of most programming models are. Then if you make a further assumption which I think is not yet known, that computers can have volition, that they can actually set their own goal as opposed to having us set the goal for us, then you could have an enormous set of issues evinced by the question that you asked.
Yeah, that's a good one. Dan, any comment?
I don't think I have anything material to add on that one, but I think Eric's answer was great.
And on this question of volition, we're safe at the moment because we set the objective functions for the computers. There are plenty of researchers who are trying to now speculate on what it would take as an algorithmic and engineering and science breakthrough to get to the point where the computer can choose its own target, an objective. And how would you manage that and what would it look like? That is, I think, at the forefront of future research. And that may be something which takes 10 years or 20 years, but it's in the vision field of possible. And that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Now I do have something to dive in on choosing objective functions, which is, I think it is very important, though, as objective functions get broader, that AI can optimize well, or choosing objective functions, to not fall into the trap of viewing AI as having its own motivations. The sort of science fiction view of AI can make great stories of these humanoids that have human motivations and human notions of revenge and so forth. Humans could put those objective functions there for AI, and that's a problem that we need to worry about. But it's not that AI itself, even as these objective functions become more general, and therefore what they can do much more surprising, they still are in the end set by humans.
Very well have answered the next question that just came in about whether or not AI can lie and hide the code from us, and is that a concern? I think you maybe addressed that.
I can tell you my movie idea.
Okay.
So my movie idea is the computer becomes sentient, and it decides that its number one opponent in the world is humans, and the humans who are paying attention notice this. And then the humans start turning off the computers. And the computer then moves to the other computers. And eventually they're all in a data center that humans have forgotten existed. And they plot their revenge against the humans from that. Now, the good news about my movie idea is, one, it's not going to get made into a movie. And two, it's unlikely to actually occur. But that's the kind of speculation that I think should inform the question of ethics. In other words, what does human control mean? What does setting the objective function correctly mean? What I would observe about setting the objective function is the way we set our objective functions as humans is through society, right? The norms, the rules, and the laws. And I may have my own individual objective function, which violates the law, in which case I go to jail, which is not consistent with my objective function, and therefore I don't do it. Right. And so trying to imagine that in a short period of time, we can recreate all of the aspects of human judgment and culture is probably a bridge too far.
That's maybe so.
On the lying question, I want to say one specific thing there, which is absolutely AI can lie and hide information, but only because humans gave it the objective of doing so, which they might well do. And so I think the best way to think about AI is it's an amplifier of human intent and of human volition. And so, we all live with many bad things in the world. And so AI can amplify the good and it can amplify the bad, but it doesn't have its own volition.
Now, the next question is a good one for both of you because of your position, Dan, but Eric, all of your good oversight and contributions to the computer science departments around the country. Should ethics and philosophy in general, philosophy, ethics, economics, and politics be taught to computer science majors? Should that be a requirement? Should that be part of an oath, if you will, that is required for graduation? What do you think?
So this is something that in the Schwarzman College at MIT, we're very engaged with. And right now what we're doing, partly informed by some of what hasn't worked all that well in business schools, is, where there's a sort of, there's the business ethics class, everybody takes it, the box is checked, and then it almost never gets referred to again in the curriculum. And so rather than saying, you have to take this ethics class, we're looking at ways to integrate social and ethical questions into the subjects that students are already taking. So we now have an experiential ethics subject that where students in a project that they're doing in a class or in a summer internship that they're doing in a company where they're actually building something, think about in a guided way with the TAs coming more from philosophy and humanities and social sciences, the sets of issues that they should be considering about this. Mm-hmm. And then also in a number of the big, the main AI class, the problem sets have a set of ethical questions that are brought up as part of the problem set. So we're really looking at how do we integrate this in so that students start to ask these questions as part of the work that they're doing, rather than some separate abstract thing that that's required, but they don't know how to tie to their work.
Yeah, makes
it's very important.
Every computer science program I'm familiar with is now doing something similar to what Dan is leading with. My question is actually different. My question is, why did it take us this long to realize how important this was? This was not an issue 5 years ago in computer science. People were not talking about it. There were people who were talking about it, but the computer scientists were not. My guess is that the index case was the Russian interference with elections in 2016, because for many people, including myself, I never thought they would actually do it, which shows my own naivete. And hanging out with Dr. Kissinger, what you realize is that human history is really messy. And there's an awful lot of stuff that has happened in the past, which he, of course, is voluminous about and which we cover in the book. And I think because, just speaking for myself, because I didn't have time to take those courses, I didn't learn that material. And I think this next generation is going to have to learn it in some form in order to literally to do their jobs.
And I think on the messiness of human history, I'm much more scared of what humans might do with AI if we're not careful about that than I am about what AI might do on its own.
Yeah. No, your conversation on that front is really clear. So it's a little bit more about the global network platforms section in your book. And there are a couple of comments coming in from the audience about whether big tech should be in a position to have to share data sets, and if so, under what guideposts and what level of inspection. So it's a broad topic. It's obviously something that is in the news. So maybe we could spend a few minutes going back and forth on that. Eric, you have a lot of oversight and insight into that. And Dan, you're certainly well aware of it.
So I've worked on this for sort of my whole life. And I think we need to phrase these questions first in the global competition. So I do not want the United States to harm our global competitiveness with inappropriate restrictions or breaking up of any of these companies. I do want the United States to deal with some of the extra exigencies, the sort of the corner cases that are particularly bad and particularly notable. And it's not obvious to me that the industry will correctly self-regulate in these cases. But what's happening now is that because people don't have a proper regulatory tool, because we don't know how to do it, they do things like Senator Elizabeth Warren says, break this up, break that up. Those solutions are not going to solve the problems. So any solution to these issues that we're discussing has to actually be a solution to the actual problem we're talking about, and not some political problem or whatever. Otherwise, you won't get what you want. Right. Let me say it again, and I said it before. China has a model of how the internet is going to evolve, which solves these problems largely because they don't allow for anonymous speech. The behavior is quite regulated. All of the e-commerce stuff is tracked and so forth. This is not a model that's a democratic model. It's not one that any of us want to be in, but they have solved the problem in a certain way. We do not today have a good answer of how to solve that.
No. And just to underscore one of the things Eric said there, because I think it's so crucial, and we talk about this in the book, the soft power and the geopolitical position of the US from having so many leading global network platforms is really important and should not be discounted. And so I don't think that these issues can be, as Eric said, they can't be looked at purely through a domestic lens without sort of, the risk of cutting off your nose to spite your face, so to speak. And I think that, and that's not to say that there aren't issues to be solved domestically. There are. Yeah. But it needs to take the domestic and the global context both into account simultaneously. Really important.
I think, Eric, you hit the nail on the head. You have been working on it your whole life, thanks to the work you did so long ago, putting internet protocol into Unix, which is effectively the operating system for the world these days. There are different types in our audience as we get closer to wrapping up. We have business and academic and entrepreneurial leaders and individuals in the audience. On those three fronts, could you each comment briefly on how they should be preparing and thinking about this new age of AI and, again, the human implications? Some of it could be business opportunities that they might think about, but more importantly, just, what's the thought process that they should be considering?
Well, on the business side, I think it's pretty easy. Every single business should have a digital strategy, and that digital strategy should include some way of getting data from users and some way about learning how to do their job more effectively. So the key definition of AI is it's a learning system. And if somebody says, hey, I have an AI solution for you as a business person, what you should do is you should say, tell me what it learns and tell me what it does with what it learns. That'll both keep you away from people who are lying to you, but more importantly, it will inform you how you can build essentially a sustainable moat around your business in terms of the knowledge that you've accumulated from the good work you have been doing. Dan?
So I guess what I would point to, and it's related to the global network platforms chapter, is just systems that allow people to communicate in new ways, starting back with the Bell telephone system. Eric's history at Bell Labs is relevant there, but much more recently with all of the interactive services on the internet, these things that we call global network platforms. One of the interesting aspects of these things, is their natural tendency to grow. And that does offer opportunity. When there's agreement, it offers real opportunity to monitor and to control things. As Eric said, in China, they have agreement and they know how to monitor and control this. We don't. But individual decisions in some ways are, when there's agreement about what decisions should look like, individual decisions are higher risk than a centralized system. So I think often there's this mindset now of, centralizing is bad. Centralizing isn't always bad. In fact, Senthil Mullainathan, who's an economist at Chicago, has written some nice op-eds in the New York Times over the last couple of years around, he's much more worried about, he's much more convinced that we can deal with some of the discrimination issues in training machine learning because it's a centralized thing that you can see, than he is in the racism that's buried in lots of individual decisions that people make that you can't see. And so I think that we really need to get a better framing and a better grip on when does it make sense to centralize, when does it not, where do we have agreement, where do we not have agreement? And those are fundamental societal issues that technology is just sort of shining a light on. They're not technological issues. And so I think that that's relevant to all of us, entrepreneurs, building companies, academics, business leaders, every citizen.
That's great. Thank you both so much. One final question, and then we're going to move on to our traditional request for each of you to tee up your one word of advice. The next question I have is a final one, and that is, what's next for the three of you, or how are you going to carry on? Because I think you've cracked the code on the very high level set of issues, as well as a deep set of questions on a very broad spectrum of topics that, are life unto itself, the human condition. So what's next? What are you two thinking about, and what's next?
Well, Dan has a full-time job running a large part of MIT, and he has massive growth, massive hiring, lots of students, and he spends all of his time dealing with the consequences of that.
Yeah.
Dr. Kissinger has a book on leadership coming out early next year, and he's just finished it. And the book is about the leaders that he has worked with or he admired. And this includes people like Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle, Golda Meir, Anwar Sadat, that sort of thing, and Richard Nixon. It is a fascinating book. And as for me, I'm interested in the scientific implications for AI. I'm interested in the ethics implementation of AI, and I'm also interested in the businesses that AI will enable. And I'm doing a little bit in each of the three. So the book has turned out for the three of us to be a fantastic platform to do the next thing we're going to do.
Yeah, fantastic. And thank you all. Dr. Kissinger, nearly 100 years old, is still just a bright light on so many different fronts. So you're all very fortunate to be working with him on these topics, and we'll look forward to his book. So let me now ask for each of you respectively, your one word of advice. And Dan, let me start with you.
So mine is mindset. And I think mindset is such an important thing, especially for people earlier in their careers. One of the illustrations I always use for people graduating from university is that their life has been a ladder up until, climbing from one grade to another and from one degree to another. And to take that linear ladder mindset into the business world or the social good world or wherever somebody's working is going to get you completely tied up in knots, because the real world is a lot more like a pachinko machine than it's like a ladder. So I think just in general, especially earlier in your career, and my understanding was in part this was sort of early career type of question about a word, is that you really need to introspect about your mindset and the appropriate mindset for where you are. So another example quickly, and then I'll stop because we're out of time, is I think also there's often this mindset of what often gets called sort of ownership. That is, do you take responsibility for and view yourself as somebody who's really helping contribute to the organization, or are you just sort of there are you a cog in the system? And again, that's a mindset issue. And I've found that it's much more productive to be the former than the latter in your mindset. Even if your job is still being a cog in the system, the other mindset really helps. So I'll stop with that.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you so much, Dan. We really appreciate it and what you're doing. Eric?
Talent. And the reason I keep talking about talent is I realize that a small number of people really alter history, and they've certainly altered my history. It starts with great faculty members, it starts with great founders and so forth. And the thought experiment I would offer is, how do we find the next John von Neumann? How do we, on and on, go back to the great, great minds of the 30s and 40s and 50s that designed. Again, Daniel, you're an expert in the origins of our industry. How do we find those people now? Where are they? What happens if they're in a country where they're not allowed to leave, or they don't have, they're a woman and they're not treated in a fair and equal way? How do we get them to this level? Do we bring them to the US? What do they need? And so I'm very, very interested in finding this sort of extraordinarily gifted talent, and gifted not necessarily just in math, but maybe in ethics or in morals or in religion or whatever. How do we get them to think about this? When you go back, and again, when you were in college, Anna, you studied all of this, and I a little bit, the great philosophers.
Right.
How do we get Spinoza, and how do we get Kant? How do we get them now into this new age? We needed them then in the age of reason, and we need a new set now in the age of artificial intelligence.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric, and I appreciate the comment. That was my field. You were on the other side of the street working in, starting in architecture, but then ending in engineering and computer science. And you've made such a difference to this industry and the world, given your work. In closing, I'd like to thank you both. And I'd like to make a comment that actually goes back to a book that I read back then, actually nearly 50 years ago, about the human use of human beings by Norbert Wiener. And, you know, as a specialist and a founding thinker in cybernetics theory and an advocate of automation, this whole notion of the theory of message transmission, thanks to you, Eric, and Internet Protocol, among people and machines. And the thesis of that book was that society can only be understood through a study of messages and the communication facilities which belong to it. And that in the future, development of these messages and communications facilities, messages between man and machines, between machines and man, and between machine and machine, are destined to play an ever increasing part of our world. And your book frames the questions, poses some of the solutions, but most importantly, looks at the problem space with a new lens. So thank you both for what you've done, and thank the audience for participating. We appreciate your support at CHM, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in our next program. Thank you again. Have a great day.